busy protesting in the U.S.
Wait, Zane, were you there when the announcement was? Oh.
How you doing? You guys wanted this recorded, right?
This morning.
Did you want content recorded or just face-to-face video with audio?
Already. There's a lot of people there.
I'm so happy I don't live in RCMI because, like, for the next 4 years, it's probably going to be a protest every weekend. It's like,
University is like blocked. You can't get through because they like close the street because people would just close the street themselves. Like.
Yeah, I can show it to you here.
So this is medical legal dying for Jewish style?
You're just exhausting everybody.
What is it?
Got them dying or something.
Comes out.
How Jewish people do it?
Being like, listen, you
I think
can't do
so,
this
yeah.
everywhere, so I'll just roll
Is there a
out
difference?
executive order.
Did you see the
3
best
weeks,
thing?
what could you do?
The best thing that happened yesterday was, whoever his, I forget what the guy's name is. The like guy who like gave the speech the first day, where it was like period, like after every. I think it's like Secretary of Public Relations,
Like
whatever
if there's
it's called.
Oh, Sean Spicer.
Out-
Yeah, that guy.
What do you do?
And so he
It's like about SARS
retweeted
now, like,
an article
it's
by
like
The
first
Onion.
people who died in SARS. It's two of like the first people
It's
were
funny.
Jewish.
Yeah, so-
Fox Jews.
Why?
They happen to be in the same
Like the
like
the
PR
headline
as
was like,
the
go, and he retweeted it.
like it was the guy who brought it from China. So
It's not.
Sorry about that.
is there actually anyone at MAM that's going to?
What?
Well, why are they there?
Yeah, no, it theoretically isn't.
Do they get pizza too or no?
Hi guys, welcome.
Take as much as you want. I think there's gonna be a lot left over. Like double size.
You can say you did an event at MAM. Alone.
Yeah.
Shots left.
I will bring the pizza in front of you.
I'm not gonna say no to that scenario.
I am.
No.
First they come to trivia, then they come to this.
So basically, we're just gonna convert.
Yeah.
Pretty much I was supposed to call on Shabbos. They gave me call on Sunday
Whose
instead.
place is this?
Which means I'm supposed to
Yours.
Sweet.
Now.
Yo, check this. This is you here.
For internal 4 days a week you're on the board.
Yeah.
1 day a week you're at the board. So it happened to be that my clinic day was Monday and they didn't see the clinic directors. So I was here all night last night. But I got I could make so I ended up pretty much I got my console getting tired and the beds were full, right? So I was thinking of making like big stink about it and like going home.
Here, you want?
If I
Sorry.
were to but like
Really?
but now they were like nice.
No, but my stepsister.
Yeah, aren't you happy enough to choose between water polo and field hockey twice?
I know, right?
You can thank Amanda for that.
Yeah.
But you're welcome to sit if you like.
You hold me.
Okay.
Yeah, we interview on Wednesday, right?
Fish live.
As MMFD.
Really wrapping up.
Where's
Where's the rest of the girls?
high quality?
No? No.
You came just for this?
No, I had a test this morning, so I was here. Pre-week. What? I do pre-week instead of lecture. Free with materials.
Testing.
No.
Rotation moves yet?
No.
Welcome, guys. More chairs coming.
F is where it's at.
Was that surgery first?
Yeah. Yeah, bro.
Why?
There, you look really
To
classy.
be honest, I did because the surgery course director was super chill about
So maybe we'll two chairs up here, just like a little bit.
Oh, that you can get out of it?
Yeah. So that's why I picked it, and kind of like surgery that I wanted to roll it in or out.
And did you?
I still am thinking about it.
So then,
didn't help.
that argument isn't valid.
Didn't help. So far, so good. I wanted to like the surgery medicine the first half of the year, so when it came to electives, I knew that like I wanted something in that
That's the
avenue.
one. Yeah.
So either surgery, like a surgery subspecialty.
Go for it. Go for it. Oh, that's why it's there. Come on.
Ariel, come on here.
Surgery, it's hard, but it's not intellectually hard. It's just like yeah. You're on making surgery.
Am I supposed to load it? Come on, phone.
In exile.
Oh no.
So here's the
Exile.
I'm communicating.
Did he get some pizza at least?
I don't know. Looks like he has his own lunch bag there.
Put E, and then A, B, C as your top.
You're on camera,
There's no
Lex.
C.
Or A or B as within your top three, you're gonna get A.
Alon, if you can hear us, wave.
So you just do E, F, and E if you want.
All right. Okay. So, thank you everyone for coming. We're very, very honored today to have Rabbi Deitsch, who is the director of Chabad. Yeah, it looks like it's working. He can hear us. Yeah. We're very honored to have Rabbi Deitsch, who's the director of Chabad Midtown. He's going to talk about end-of-life Jewish ethics. So, you know, you're in the hospital, and then you have a Jewish patient, and sometimes you can have an Orthodox patient, and they have concerns with end-of-life care. So they often call a rabbi. So you might actually meet Rabbi Deitsch in the hospital. He has a very large community downtown, so he's in the hospital often. So he's going to talk about that perspective. He's also going to talk about his own perspective. Recently had a family member, terminally ill family member. So he'll also talk about that side as well. Without any further ado.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's great to see everybody coming together to learn and hear a little bit of the Jewish perspective on the end of life. I understand we'll do some question-answer period towards the end. It's always good to start off with on a light note. So they say there was one time this doctor that used to go to synagogue every Saturday. And every time he came to the synagogue, he would be bombarded with questions. People would keep their questions all week. Instead of wasting their time and go to the clinic, they would wait till he would come to the synagogue, and they would ask him, what do you do if my elbow's like this, my foot's like that, my stomach, my head, Everybody would keep their questions. And after a while, it got to him. He could never pray properly because everybody was bothering him all the time. So he went one day over to this lawyer that was in the synagogue, and he said to him, he says, what do you do? Everybody's asking me these questions the entire service, and I can't concentrate. So he said, I'll tell you what to do. He says, when you come to the office on Monday, send everybody an invoice. Whoever asked you a question on Saturday, send them a bill for their, for inquiring for your medical opinion, and you'll see they'll stop bothering you. So he thought, wow, that must be a great idea. So he comes to his office Monday morning, and under his door, there's an invoice from the lawyer. So the truth is that being a doctor is a big responsibility because it's a great opportunity, a great merit, but it also comes with a great responsibility. And I want to share with you a little bit of that responsibility, especially if you come and encounter with somebody in the situation that they seem like they're at the end of their life. So I copied a couple of important quotes from Jewish literature to talk about the value of life and what it means to be sensitive and be careful. And of course, what's going on now in the politics in the world, it's also good to think about this idea also of the importance of the value of a human being's life and how careful and sensitive we have to be so careful for somebody's life. So I copied. If you open it to the next page, which is like the number 2 there, at page 2. This is a quote going back to one of our most important sources in Jewish literature. I'm not sure how familiar you are in the importance of Jewish literature, but as Jews, you know that everything has to be based from the Torah, straight from the Bible. If you could find a verse, a quote, a source in the Bible, then you're on good grounds. So the Torah tells us in Genesis, in the first book of the Torah, it tells us the following. And I want you to look inside so you get to see carefully how God words this instruction. And this is talking about the period after the flood, with Noah and the flood. The whole world was put into a flood because God decided kind of to start over the world. So it says like this: "But your blood of your souls I will demand an account. From the hand of every beast I will demand it. And from the hand of man, from the hand of each man, his brother, I will demand the soul of man." In other words, God's saying, I want responsibility. And then it says the following in the next verse: "Whoever sheds the blood of man through man, shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God he made man." And this here really becomes the key. These words becomes the key of our responsibility in how we take care of patients. To understand this one point, and then from this point you could go and you could elaborate and try to understand and how to rule whenever there comes a gray area situation that you're unfamiliar with how to deal with. The key is to remember that the responsibility for someone else's blood is because human beings and animals, and human beings more particularly, are created in the image of God. And because we're made in the image of God, that means we have within us the essence of God. And therefore, we have to be very careful that if we are the cause to bringing somebody's life shorter, that they die before the time that they're allotted to die, we could be responsible for what we call spilling somebody's blood, which means basically taking the person's life before the time. And this is always the consideration, because human beings are made in the image of God. And it's for this reason that we have this great responsibility. Now, how far does this responsibility go? And in what circumstances do we always have to be so careful about if we may do something wrong that may cause somebody else's life to be shortened? A big question comes all the time when you're in a hospital and somebody could be deathly sick and complaining of pain, and people feel exhausted from all the pain, and you can only imagine and say rightfully so. It's very hard to endure pain. It's also hard to watch somebody in pain. But how far are we supposed to go? To what extent are we supposed to go to say to somebody, okay, you know what, you really want to die? Let me help you. Let me assist you on this. So we turn the page. This is a more contemporary sage who lived. His name was Rabbi Yechiel Epstein. He's known as, for his book that he wrote, known as the Aruch HaShulchan, which is basically a book compiled with Jewish law based on all the teachings of our sages to understand our responsibilities. And he writes the following. He died in 1908, and so it's the most recent, from one of the most recent strong opinions in Jewish authority. And he says the following: there's something called a goses. A goses means a person who's like on the end of their life. They're just grasping for their last breath. So a goses is regarded as a living person in avert respect. Though the patient is in great agony and he deems death preferable, nevertheless we are forbidden to do anything to hasten his death, because the universe and all therein belongs to God, and this is his will. So just because a patient comes to you and says, oh, you know what, I want to go, it's not that simple that you could say, okay, let me assist the person. Because especially when a person's in pain, they may not be able to rationally make the right decision. And we have to remember, as doctors or anybody that's involved that could play a role there, we have to remember that our question has to be is, what is God's will? Does God want us to help this person to assist them to die, or does God want us to try to keep them alive as long as possible? What is the desire of God? And I want to bring with you a little incident that happened a couple years ago. Unfortunately, I had a brother that had lung cancer, and he fought like a lion to to stay alive and overcome it. He had a wife, 4 children, and it was by God's desire, obviously, that it got worse and worse and worse. And at the end period, it got very, very stressful for him, as he was very limited in what he could accomplish, and us as a family to make the right decisions. Fortunately, the doctors were very cooperative with the family, and they were trying to be as respectful as humanly possible in these conditions. And I remember the last month or so, maybe even 2 months of his life, every few days we would have a meeting with the few doctors and the family members, and we would talk about the situation of what could be done. Should we how heroic steps should we make to keep his life longer? How much? What's the value of the life to keep it longer? And every time we got to a corner, we sat down and we made a conference call, and we would call one of the senior rabbis that's very well versed in the subject of medical intervention, and also well versed in the Torah's perspective. And we would have a conference call, and the doctors would speak, explain their perspective on the situation, and then this rabbi would weigh in and tell us what is the Torah's perspective, what is God's desire in this case. And I remember one particular case. The rabbi was actually a Toronto rabbi. May he live long and be well. He's Rabbi David Shachat, who lives up in Thornhill. Very well respected rabbi. And the doctors basically, put it on the table and said that, in their estimation, there'll be X amount of days that he'll be able to live, but what should we do? They said we could give these different kinds of medications, all kinds of stuff that we have today, that we could prolong his life, even if he falls into a coma, which eventually that he did fall into a coma. But the rabbi basically explained to us like this. The Torah's perspective is that we have to do what's naturally in our ability to keep somebody alive, which means in the natural way to do steps, he says you have to give water and oxygen. Those are the responsible things you have to do. To take heroic steps to keep a person alive, if they're in pain or if they're not aware anymore what's happening, it's not an obligation of Jewish law to take heroic steps to keep somebody, to prolong someone's life at that stage. This is also an important point to remember. But what I want to emphasize is that every time when you come to such a situation, if you're in such a situation, you have to make these kinds of decisions. It's very important that after understanding all the medical steps of what's involved, then to call a rabbi that's a competent person, a competent rabbi in this field that understands these fields, and then let them weigh in on their opinion. Because every situation is obviously different. Every medical situation is different. We had a case in our community. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Chabad today, but Chabad is more or less around the globe. And we got a call one day from a Jewish family living in Winnipeg. This woman called us that she has a sister who just gave birth that morning in Mount Sinai Hospital right here. And the delivery did not go that well. The baby survived, but the mother lost so much blood and she went unconscious. And she became brain dead. It was a very sad situation. They called us to see what we could do to help. It turns out that this family, they lived almost across the street from us in a little building, in the back of a building. We didn't even know that they existed, that they were living there. The husband, a saint of a guy, unbelievable. He's probably around 50 years old. Married this wonderful girl, a Canadian girl. They had one child, healthy kid, and a year and a half later had a second child, and now the mother went brain dead. And now what do? It's a painful situation. Okay, the woman is not in pain, but today it's almost 8 years later, and she's still on machines, brain dead in one of the hospitals in downtown Toronto. Right? So the question you ask is it our responsibility as human beings to end the person's life, or is it our responsibility to keep them on the machines or do whatever it takes to keep their life as long as possible? So I want to refer to the next quote. Go where it says page number 4. Here's a quote from Ethics of Our Fathers, known as the Mishnah of Pirkei Avot. Now, Pirkei Avot is written by the earliest Jewish sages, written about almost 2,500 years ago. It's in the Mishnah, and it gives us perspective on the quality of life and importance of each step of life. It's known to be the book to go beyond the letter of the law. It gives you like the insights of character of people. It doesn't always tell you what to do, it just tells you points of value. So here it tells you the following. The sages teach us the following. He used to say, this is a quote from the quote before. It says like this: 1 hour of repentance for sin, obviously, 1 hour of repentance and good deeds in this world is better than all the life of the world to come. So this is a very important thing to consider. If we do one good deed in this world now, it's worth better than all the Garden of Eden that we can get when we turn 120 and we come to the world to come. More important is our deeds in this world than anything else. This is an important value to think of, because when you think about this, you realize that every deed that you do is tremendous. Imagine how great it is in the world to come, in the Garden of Eden, in the place where it's all peaceful and we don't have any all the limitations and agonies that we have here in this world, of pain and suffering and so on. That's what's the Garden of Eden. It's a life pretty much the soul without a body. But it's more worth it, more value, to do one good deed here in this world. And then it concludes, and 1 hour of bliss in the world to come is better than all the life in this world. In other words, a little bit of the bliss, of the greatness, of the being in the presence with God's divine presence is worth more than all the deeds we do here. So imagine that the one deed we do here, how much great comfort we can get to in the world to come. So again, this is something that we need to think about. Now, let's turn to the next page. And for this, I want to give you a small introduction. The way the Torah works, and the history of the Torah, I just want to go over a little bit of the history so we can grasp the importance of this next section of law. This next section of law is called the Mishnah Torah, which is the name of the book written by the Rambam, or other known as Maimonides. Now, Maimonides was a physician himself. He was a doctor for the Sultan, and he was also one of the greatest Jewish philosophers and Jewish law thinkers of Jewish law. Now, if you go through the history, the Torah was given on Mount Sinai. Moses brought down the Torah on Mount Sinai in the presence of all the Jewish people. A couple million people were standing there at the foot of Sinai. And he brings down the tablets, he brings down the Torah, he teaches it to the Jewish people. Now you have to remember, at those days, we didn't have all the side distractions that we have today. People were much more focused, and we were smarter in that aspect. We were able to grasp a lot. So it was easy to grasp the wisdom of God through our greatest teacher, Moses. But then, over the generations, we started to argue in what Moses meant, in what the Torah meant. What was this quote? What was that quote? And naturally, we needed clarity to remember. So somebody would come and say, oh, my grandfather, my grandmother, they would interpret this phrase so-and-so, right? So everybody had different points, and whoever would bring better sources and had more people that voted to the side of that way of interpretation, the Torah deems that majority wins. That's the way the laws were made. And after about 12 or 1300 years, one of our greatest sages, his name was Rabbi Yehuda, or Rabbi Judah the Prince, he decided that it was time that we document all these interpretations on the Torah. Because if we don't document, the arguments will only increase and we'll have less clarity as the generations go. What was the name of the books that he documented? It was called the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah has 60 different books, broken into 6 different sections. One talks about agriculture, one talks about the holidays of the year, all the Jewish holidays, one talks about all the laws of women, the women's rights, the women's body, marrying somebody, all these kind of laws, divorce. All these laws are in another section. The laws that pertain more into the time of the temple, the laws per the offerings that were brought in the temple, the services, and so on and so forth. Laws of damages. If you damage somebody else's property, what if my animal walked into your property and damaged your property? Who's responsible? And so on and so forth. The laws are quite complex, and you can learn them a lifetime. After about 500 years of studying the Mishnah and how the Mishnah explains the Torah itself, the Bible, again, we started coming into arguments. What does the Mishnah mean? And the Mishnah, we realized, was written shorthand, even though at the beginning when it was written, it was like the most lengthiest thing. So we started to discuss it. And remember, every argument by the sages is called an argument for the sake of peace. It's not an argument to prove who's right. The argument is to prove what is God's desire. And every subject would be clearly articulated and argued. One would say this, one would say that, and sometimes 3-way arguments, sometimes 4-way arguments, and sometimes we came to a standstill and there's no answer. Right? And it will say that. It will say, in this subject we have no answer, we got to wait for the coming of Mashiach. Elijah will come and teach us the answer. But on most subjects we have the answer. Now, this is a whole set of books was written explaining the Mishnah is known as the Talmud. Okay, the Talmud explains the Mishnah. The Talmud has today 2,700 double-sided pages, all written in Aramaic. Okay, of course, today it's translated into many different languages, and it teaches you how to think, how to analyze. Think through a subject, think through a question, and don't just, come to a conclusion quickly. After the Talmud was written, at the end of the destruction of the Second Temple, going back approximately 2,000 years ago. That was the main study books that Jews would study. We would study the Talmud day in, day out, morning to night, to understand it and understand what the laws are. But after about 1,100 years of studying the Talmud, our minds were a lot weaker than they were for the generations before, and it became very hard to understand what the conclusion of a 10-page argument is. What's the bottom line? What's the law? Because for 10 pages, we're arguing. Imagine for a month, you're sitting here and you're arguing. At the end of the month, you're like, okay, bottom line, what's the conclusion? So people didn't know what to do. Bottom line, what's the law? So God gave a gift to the world, and this was Maimonides. His name was Rabbi Moshe, the son of Maimon. We call him in Hebrew the Rambam because that's the acronym for his name. And Maimonides was this unbelievable, smart person, a very devout Jewish person. He lived in Muslim countries, and even though he lived there with the Muslims, they got along amazing, and he was a blessing to the communities, and everybody loved him with great respect. Now the Rambam, Maimonides, decided to make a book that's the code of the Jewish law. It's going to be the bottom line, what's the law, how to practice. He has a section on ethics, a section on Shabbos laws, a section that deals with laws for doctors, and all kinds of laws, diets, how to eat, not to how to mix liquid in the middle of the foods, and not to how much time to sleep. He says a person should sleep around 8 hours a day. He has all kinds of very interesting stuff that he goes through, and a lot of important Jewish value of ethics, which is a subject that needs to have its own lengthy course. But here I want to quote to you in the laws of Shabbos. Saturday, we know, is our most sacred day of the week. Saturday, it's a day of rest, and we're not allowed to do a lot of things on Saturday. Why? Because we have to rest. What's called rest? The Torah tells us what's called rest. Right? Just like what's called work, what's called rest, the Torah defines as rest. Because sometimes a person says rest means to sit and watch, a 10-hour episode. Well, the Torah may have a different perspective of what's called rest. Right? So we have to decide what's called rest. And when are we allowed to violate the laws of the Shabbos? Also, there's a set of rules for that. Now, on Shabbos, one of the things we're not allowed to do is we're not allowed to do anything that ignites a fire. We're not allowed to cause something that's going to cause an electric reaction that will cause some kind of fire to come out. It's one of the prohibitions on Shabbos. This makes it very difficult, or it makes the law that we don't drive on Shabbos. Now, what happens if a woman has to give birth and it's Shabbos? How do you get them to the hospital? So there's a law that's the following. Anything that's a question of life or death, you're allowed to violate the Shabbos laws to take care of a person's situation for life or death. Even if it's a questionable life or death. So if a woman comes and says, I'm going into labor, even if you're not 100% sure, you could get into a car, drive your car, no problem. You can call a taxi if you want, you can call an Uber, whatever you want. There's no problem. You're allowed to violate all the laws, whatever needs to be done, because it's a matter of life or death. Now, here's a situation that Maimonides brings down. I want to learn this piece inside with you. I talk about the sacredity of Shabbos, but also the importance of life or death. Here, follow this thing on page 5. The laws of the Shabbos are suspended in the face of a danger to life, as are the obligations of the other commandments, other mitzvahs. Therefore, we may perform according to the directives of a professional physician of that locale. That means that if there's a doctor that says somebody's weak, we got to take him to the hospital, that's a good enough rule. Okay, even if somebody comes and says, that person, he's not so sick. If there's a doctor there that says the person is sick, there's no question about it. You could take the person, you could violate all the laws, there's no problem. Because of the value of life. Now there comes the next scenario. When an avalanche has fallen, and there is a doubt whether or not it has fallen over a person, we're not sure. It may be cleared, which normally you're not allowed to collect a pile of rubble on the Shabbos. That's called work, and you're not allowed to move a whole pile of rubble or stone to a side on the Shabbos. But if we think maybe there's a person under there, no problem, you can move the whole pile. If the person was discovered to be alive, but was crushed by the fallen debris, to the extent that it's impossible that he will recover the debris, it may be cleared, and the person take it out to enable him to live however long he does. Now this here is an important line here, because if you read this slowly, you realize that what Maimonides is telling us is that you see this person, he's stuck under the debris, he looks like he's basically finished. Doesn't look like there's any hope. So you may say to yourself, it's Shabbos. Why should we desecrate the law of Shabbos? The person's dying anyways. There's no way I'm going to be able to pull him out from this thing. It's not going to happen. So Maimonides rules that you're allowed to desecrate. You need to desecrate the Shabbos to pull off all the debris, because maybe you could prolong his life even for 1 minute. The value of a person's life for even 1 more minute, it's worth it to desecrate the laws of the holiness of the Shabbos. And now we ask ourselves, why is it so important? Why is it so important? You see somebody that's dying, and it looks like everybody around says this person, that's it, they're finished. Another few more breaths, that's it. Why would we go to the extent to move the debris away? So I want to share with you a small story. And this story, I think you could use it. And remember this story, because there'll be times where this story, I think, will help us. In the time of the Romans, in the time of the Roman emperor, in the time of the Second Temple, there was a very cruel Roman emperor, and he decided that he wanted to put an end to some of the Jewish sages that were alive at the time. Okay? And he burnt alive 10 of the greatest sages in the Jewish world. This recounting of the cruelty in how these 10 sages were killed, we read it every year on Yom Kippur, when you're in the synagogue on Yom Kippur, the only reason why a lot of people don't know this section is because it's like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A lot of times people already, you went for your little rest. But if you stay in the synagogue this year, Yom Kippur, a little bit longer, you'll get to this point, and we read about the horror of the death of these 10 sages. And the story goes, it quotes there, that the emperor called for them, and he said to them that this is your punishment, and I'm decreeing that I'm going to take your life. And they asked the emperor if he could give them permission, because they want to ask God. These sages had a communication with God. They wanted to ask God, what was God's will here? Did God want that we should be killed under the emperor? Then we'll go happily if this is God's desire. But if it's not God's desire, we're going to tell the emperor. The emperor said, okay, if you have that communication, talk to God. So they asked God if this is the plan for the terror to happen in this way. And God says, yes, I had given my approval to this. So one of the sages asked God and says, God, no problem. If this is your desire, I'll do it. But he says, please, can you explain to me the reason for this? What's the reason? And God says to the sage, shtaik, which means be quiet. This is what I decreed. And the sage asks again and says, please, God, we're going to go anyways, but give us the rationale behind it. And God says, I said to be quiet, and if you ask me again, I will turn over the whole world back to the way it was in the beginning of creation. I'll destroy the world back to the beginning. Okay, such harsh words from God. He doesn't ask another word, and they go pretty much into the fire. And the details are there, described there of how they were killed. But the Kabbalistic sages, the mystic sages, ask a question on this story, on this part of the story. And they say, what kind of response was this from God to them? If you ask this question again, I'm going to turn back the world to the beginning. Is that the way we're supposed to talk? You threaten you're going to turn back the world to the beginning? Why does God answer in such a way? So the mystics explain it with the following analogy. They say there was once a king that desired to have a beautiful new gown made for himself. And he wanted it to be the most exquisite, beautiful gown. And the king sent out a message to the entire world that he's looking for the most finest silk quality of material to make this beautiful gown. And finally, from across the world, they bring this most finest, expensive material, comes to the king, and the king takes this material and he feels it, and he says, it's beautiful, the color is beautiful, the feel is great. He says, this is the garment. Now, next step, we need to find a tailor. Yeah, you know how to say a tailor in Yiddish? A Schneider. He's looking for the Schneider. Finally, from search for a good Schneider, for a good tailor, everybody's scared to take the job. Nobody wants to be the tailor for the king, because God forbid you mess up something, you'll be a head shorter. So he takes this, finally, Yankel the Schneider, Yankel, this Jewish tailor, he comes to the king and he says, Your Honor, he says, I'm willing to take the task. I'll make this gown for you. Gives him the material and he says, remember, you have 30 days to come back with this beautiful gown. And remember, because the material is so expensive, make sure you use every single piece of this material to make this gown. Don't waste anything. He says, no problem. The man goes and he works on his machines day and night. And before the month is over, he comes back with this gown and he brings it to the king. And the king puts it on and it's magnificent. Everybody's ranting and raving. It's unbelievable. The king is happy, pays him a nice sum for his work. And the next day, one of the king's advisors comes to the king and says to him, he says, Your Honor, he says, do you really believe that there's a chance that Yankel the Schneider, this tailor, do you really believe that he didn't pocket any of the extra material? How's it possible that he used every single piece of material to make the gown? I'm sure he saved a piece to make a fortune off it. It's impossible that he would use every single piece of cloth to make the gown. The king thinks about it a little bit and he says, this man he's probably right. So the king summons Yankel the Schneider, and Yankel comes, and the king says to him, "No, how did you make it? Every single piece you used, you didn't waste or snitch or hide one piece of this. It doesn't make sense that you could have really used every single piece." So Yankel says to the king, he says, "Your Honor," he says, "I could prove it to you and I could show you how I used every single piece of material and I didn't take a piece." He says, "In order for me to show this to you, I need you to give me the gown, and I'm going to have to undo every single stitch of this garment, undo it back to the beginning, to this open piece of material, and then I could show you and sew it back stitch by stitch to show you how I used every single piece." Says the mystics that this is what God was telling these sages. You want to understand how I run this world? You want to have it all figured out? For that, I have to undo the world every day, all the way back to the beginning, to the first day of creation, and follow me around and see how every single day is the puzzle to my ultimate plan. Then you'll understand why this is my decree today. But obviously, it's not in the human comprehension to be able to understand how God runs the world every day in the way God runs the world. And therefore, God said to them that I'll have to take the world back to the way it was in the beginning, because that's the only way you'll be able to understand. And it's no wonder that us human beings with finite ability of comprehension, no matter how smart a person is, no matter how capable we are, we're still finite at the end of the day. So it's no wonder that us finite human beings cannot comprehend the way God works. So when you see somebody that's in an unfortunate situation of health in the end of their life, we cannot understand why this is like this. We believe and we understand and we remember that this is God's desire, that this is the way it should be now. It's our job as doctors, as human beings, to intervene as much as possible, as humanly possible, to help out, to make it the most comfortable and the most rewarding for a person to have in their life. And for this, I want to share with you one quote on the next page, and then we'll open up to some questions. This is a quote on page 6. It comes from a book called Hayom Yom, a worthwhile book if you can get a hold of it. Every day it has a very important, valuable quote that has all kinds of good sources. And on the quote of the day of the 5th of Iyar, that's the Hebrew date when this calendar was made. The quote for the day was compiled in 1943 by the Chabad Rebbe, and he quotes the following quote. That the Alter Rebbe, who was the first Chabad Rebbe, received the following teaching from a great righteous person named Rabbi Mordechai, who had heard it from the Baal Shem Tov. He heard the following quote. The Baal Shem Tov was the first Hasidic leader, lived about 300 and so years ago, and the Baal Shem Tov, who was known to be one of the greatest sages of his time, said the following statement. A soul may descend to this world. A soul comes down into our body. That's what you live with your soul. It may come down into this world and live for 70 or 80 years, however long you're destined to live in this world, in order to do a Jew a material favor and certainly a spiritual one. So it's possible that the whole reason why, our whole job that we're doing here on this world, especially as a doctor, which your whole life is about helping people, it could be just one deed that's the main deed that you're here in this world for, let alone many deeds. And a material deed, helping somebody, giving them something, bringing them even, it could be even a cup of water. It could be as simple as that. But our little deeds that we do could be and is the purpose of us here in life. He quotes here that this is in order for a Jew to do a material favor. It's important to remember that when it says over here this is to do a material favor for a Jew, that means obviously for a Jew to be able to do another favor even for a non-Jew. But if you help your brother, you help your sister, of course you're going to be able to help your cousin. You have to be alive to be able to do that. You have to be well to be able to do that. And hence the importance and the great honor that God bestows upon a person that's a doctor A doctor is the messenger of God to bring healing and health to another person. Which brings to one more final point. As a doctor, we have the rights to prescribe people to medicine and whatever medication you can do or whatever advice to help patients. But we have to remember that a doctor is a doctor. A doctor is not a prophet. I find a lot of times people come to me and they went to some doctor and the doctor said to them, like a prophet, they says, you only have 3 weeks left to live. You only have 6 months left to live. That's the job of a prophet. And we don't have prophets today. But a doctor's job is to say that based on my research or based on medical, research, this is what you need to do to help you to live as best as possible going forward. But we're not here to tell people how long they could live or what will guarantee happen to them. This we don't know. As we see many times, doctors tell people certain things, you're going to live a certain amount of time, and they live a lot longer. So the doctor says, I made a mistake. Right? But really, we have to be careful and sensitive and have the apathy when we speak to a person and a patient to be as careful as we can, not to predict things, but just humbly to say that God allowed us to be his messenger to bring a healing to a person. And this is also the reason why in Jewish law that we're allowed to go to doctors, and we're supposed to go to doctors if we need help. A person shouldn't come and say, I have so much faith in God, I'm not going to go to a doctor, I'm just going to talk to God. Because God says in the Torah that you should go to a doctor when you need to have medical help. So this is what we call a little bit about end of life on one foot, because obviously this is a discussion that we could talk in great length, but this is just some highlights that I pointed out. If anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to address them. What?
If there are questions from them.
Alon does not look happy about that. Oh, he can hear from any microphone.
Any questions from Mam?
I'm good. Thank you so much.
Any questions?
I have a question about you talked about the woman who gave birth and was brain dead or still is, I guess, somewhere in a hospital. So I assume that the Torah has a definition for death somewhere, but I think, like most doctors would probably say that she's brain dead, this woman is dead, you're not really keeping her alive, you're keeping her body alive. So how does the Torah define death, and how would you talk to a Jewish patient about that? What context would they be seeing death in versus how a doctor might see death?
Okay, so that's a good question. Death in Jewish law means that the soul leaves the body. It means there's no movement. The heart is the final organ that pushes the life through the whole body. So even if you have one part of the body that could be dead, right, a person's arm, or if doctors say that they could see that the brain is dead or other parts, the person is still considered alive. Now, one of the things, there was somebody once proposed a question to the Chabad Rebbe about a difficult stage that this person's father was having in pain and didn't see any value in the stage of life because the person was quite crippled and had very little ability to do anything in this world. And the Rebbe explained to the person that if the person's in a stage that the person could verbally say a blessing, let's say, that alone makes a reason for the soul to still be in the body. Again, as we said before, we don't understand why God put into the stage, but being what it is, the fact that the soul is still there in the body means that there's some kind of purpose in this scenario. So it could be that a person is in a very weak situation, but at least they could verbally say a positive thing, a blessing of some kind. If a person could have a little movement in their hand, you could even assist them by putting $1, let's say, or a coin into their hand and help them to put a coin into a charity box. That alone is considered to be a good deed that you can only do here in this world with your body. Right? Now, sometimes people are in situations where they can't even do that. So it's brought down that besides, for whatever reason, God decided that their soul should still be in their bodies and they should not die completely. There's also some kind of indirect awakening to the people around that person. So when other people come and say a prayer next to that person, that alone is bringing more prayer and more positivity in the world. As you know, Maimonides says that when you do a good deed or you say a prayer on one side of the world, it affects a good deed on the other side of the world. So in the literal answer to your question is that the Torah deems dead, complete death, when the soul departs the body and there's no movement at all. As long as there's still movement in the body, it's still considered to be alive. Right? Which brings you, by the way, to another scenario, that if you ever encounter this scenario, at the end of a person's life, it says that when a person's literally their soul is leaving the world, it's important to let the soul leave in peace. Okay, that means kind of like a smooth transition. Sometimes people are in the room and they're screaming because it's very emotional to be there in the situation. A lot of noise keeps the soul from moving on to the next world. Yeah. So we try to keep it as much as possible. When we're talking about souls, I'll share with you a story. There was a guy that came in the 1980s, a Holocaust survivor, and he came to New York and he wanted to meet one of the greatest sages of our generation, was the Chabad Rebbe, and he wanted to meet him, and he had a big problem for many years since the Holocaust. What was his dilemma? So he asked the Rebbe the following. He said, ever since the Holocaust, every single night, my brother, who was killed during the Holocaust, comes to me in a dream. Every single night. And I can't get it to rest. I can't get it out of my head. Every single night, so many years, like it haunts him. He wants to move on. And the Rebbe asked him if anybody ever said Kaddish since your brother passed away, for your brother. Kaddish is a special prayer that we say during the year after somebody passes away. The man said no. He says, we didn't even know when he died. We didn't know exactly. We knew he went to some camp. So the Rebbe told him that the family should pick one day in the year and establish that as the anniversary date of his passing. And every year on that date, you should say this prayer Kaddish. Why? He said, by saying this prayer, it will help the soul of your brother to settle down. So we find that, I'm bringing you the story because we find that even when a soul departs, it needs to have the right prayers and, the right tone in order for it to settle down. But as long as it's in the body, it's still considered alive.
So we're going to say thank you very much to Rabbi Deitsch for coming.
You're very welcome. Next time to talk on the beginning of life.
And thank you everyone for participating.
My pleasure.
No.